So thank you very much for inviting me to this symposium, and feel privileged to be the first speaker who starts this series with my short paper on pioneering ideas of public park design in German-speaking cities, actually towards the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. Summing up the existence of early public parks in the German-speaking realm in 15 minutes is quite a challenge, and then therefore my intervention will be rather polemic, if you don't mind. And I will try to focus on the evolution of early implementations of the idea of the public park in some German-speaking cities with the help of selected case studies. When it comes to the concept of the public park as a complex landscape design assignment, rather than just a public green space of less conscious origins, the first person to be mentioned is a philosophy professor at the University of Kiel, Christian Kai Lorenz Hirschfeld. His 5-volume grand treatise on the theory of garden art was so influential in the German-speaking realm that it became a cornerstone and principal reference in late 18th century landscape design across large parts of continental Europe. In the final volume of his work, which appeared in 1785, he dedicated a chapter to public parks, including their design and program, that he called Volksgarten. The concept of the Volksgarten, or people's garden in German, appears to be overlooked in English landscape historiography, perhaps because of its nomenclature. As it is not directly or word for word translates to public park, it has perhaps been dismissed in the Anglo-Saxon world as being neither public nor a park, but mere garden. But this approach will be equal to dismissing dachshund as not being the same as sausage dog, although we know they are. The Oxford Companion to Gardens calls the Volksgarten, and I quote, a peculiarly German development, and distinguishes it from the, I quote again, public park proper, end of quote, but without explaining why it is not, and the last quote here, an open space belonging to the public as of right, and provided with facilities which could meet the demands of the new industrial cities. I find it even more peculiar that public parks should only exist in new industrial cities. Why would they? Circumstances that define cities of the Industrial Revolution have been there since the beginning of urbanization. Air, water, light, and noise pollution, the crowdedness, lack of sewage, transmissible diseases, and so forth. Cannot really see the difference between the various sources that evolved during history and made urban environments so infamously unhealthy. Tellingly, the aforementioned Oxford Companion to Gardens entry cannot clarify the differences between public promenades, Volksgarten, or public parks. Instead, it further confuses the reader by using terms and examples interchangeably, and claiming that Hirschfeld differentiates the Volksgarten from the public promenade by its buildings of patriotic overtones, when Hirschfeld did no such thing. Hirschfeld himself did not clarify the difference between public promenades, what he calls Spaziergänge, and public parks or Volksgarten, but implied that the latter is richer in its program. He specifically mentioned exercise, the joy of the fresh air, getting away from work activities, the social interactions, and the requirement of the design to facilitate these pursuits. He confirms that all levels of society have the right to enjoy these places at any time and unhindered. As for the layout of these public parks, Hirschfeld emphasized the variety of formal solutions, the separation of footpaths from bridleways, dynamic planting design that allows both shade and open spaces with vistas, the need for benches, resting places, shelters, food, and refreshment stalls, all proportionate with the visitor numbers. In addition to these basic amenities, he also suggested to allow boating and fishing if there is a lake in the park, install the equivalents of the modern bandstand for musical entertainment, and erect monuments to the benefactors, poets, heroes, and other worthy members of the community. Here we have all the program and elements of a proper public park, probably everything that can be expected from them. In fact, the word Volksgarten still denotes public park, even if a later word of Stadtpark or urban park evolved alongside this. To prove this point, I would like to introduce an admittedly crude survey of the usage of these words in contemporary periodicals. The digitized content of German periodicals in the collection of the Austrian National Library allows us to detect how frequently the word was used. The first mention of the word Volksgarten is in 1785, the same year as Hirschfeld's publication. And although it only appears in a handful of times until the end of the first decade in the 19th century, it is gaining popularity in the 1820s and 1830s, and mentioned more than 100 times starting from 1840, reaching its first peak in the mid-70s, and following some decline, it was mentioned well over 1,000 times a year in the early 20th century. The word Stadtpark only started to be used in the 1860s, but quite visibly coexisted with Volksgarten, and some of its decline coincided with the rise in the use of the latter, like in the late 1890s, where you can see a drop in Stadtpark, but an increase in Volksgarten. The word Volkspark, on the other hand, never gained popularity. If we analyze the combined use of the two words, we can see a continuous rise with negative periods that coincide with economic decline, such as the Great War or the Great Depression. To conclude, Volkspark has always meant public park, and the concept was in full bloom since the publication of Hirschfeld's work. However, Hirschfeld struggled to introduce a proper public park to its readers, which was the result of the good governance of a city, as he envisaged the inception of such public spaces. He therefore had to resort to discussing openly accessible royal gardens and parks until public parks reached desired recognition in society, as he put it. But help was very near. In the same year as the publication of the 5th volume of his grand treatise, Hirschfeld also published the 4th iteration of his garden calendar, which included a description of a public park in Hirschberg in Silesia, which is today Jelenia Góra in Poland. The description was provided by a certain Thebesius, and Hirschfeld was able to refer to his own chapter on this topic published earlier that year. In the explanatory footnote, Hirschfeld praised the town's authorities for making such an excellent service to its burghers, strongly implying that this was a community effort. And you can see this probably, according to Ulrich Janke, is the Cavalier bag in the middle of the picture, down just south from the town. Despite the author's assertion this was a true public park of Ware Volksgarten, further specifications on ownership and accessibility were not shared. However, taking into consideration that what he said in his treatise, it is fair to assume that the Hirschberg Park fulfilled his expectations regarding public ownership and access for all. The ambition to create the first real public park in the world was on the mind of the Lübeck-born Christian Heinrich Nebien, an agronomist, landscape designer, and economic advisor, when he submitted his design for the Városliget Park in Budapest in 1816. The city of Pest, today part of Budapest, claimed ownership over the area of Városliget after the reconquest of this part of the country at the end of the 17th century, following its long Ottoman occupation. The city was determined to turn this swampy area into wooded land, partly to protect the inner parts of the city from sandblasts that were a regular occurrence, bringing sand from the Great Hungarian Plain to the city from the east. Afforestation efforts commenced in the middle of the 18th century, but with little success. In the 1790s, the mayor of the city, also a chief advocate of turning the area into a public park, concentrated more municipal resources on the project, but it resulted in only modest successes. This is on the top right corner on this map, the Városliget. A design competition was announced in 1813, to which no less a person than the later Royal Prussian Garden Director, Peter Joseph Lenné, also submitted his proposal. What was his first known landscape design while on tour in Vienna, but lost out. The eventual winner, the above-mentioned Heinrich Nebien, delivered his ambitious but costly design only in 1816, with a view to publish it. Nebien was well aware of his groundbreaking role in putting Hirschfeld's principles in practice for what he thought was the first time. Although the City Council of Pest annually transferred funds to the coffers of the Embellishment Committee, and the income generated from auctioning land between the park and the western suburbs in 1808 was also contributing to its budget, it was clear from the beginning that the city needs to raise money from public subscription, equivalent to today's crowdfunding initiatives, in a way that the sponsors didn't get any stake in the development. Call for donations in 1818 resulted in less than the tenth of the planned budget, ranging from 6,000 florins offered by the Palatine of the country, Archduke Joseph, to 2 florins from around 340 individuals. In consequence, the pretentious architecture features, such as the entrance gate, which of course strongly resembles the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, were struck out. But the plantings, water features, and walks were in large part carried out as planned in the following 10 years. And hospitality establishments were erected to entertain as well as feed the visiting crowd. The desired features of public parks in German-speaking cities, and the city of Pest was one of them, was well developed, and there must have been other successful attempts to put these into practice. However, this practice and even the theories behind it remained largely unnoticed by the professional world in Britain. And I argue that they still are. That's the point I'm trying to make here. Although the most important horticulture writer of his time, John Claudius Loudon, wrote in 1822 in his seminal Encyclopedia of Gardening that, I quote, "Our continental neighbors have hitherto greatly excelled us in this department of gardening," meaning public parks. He curiously missed referencing Hirschfeld's chapter on the topic, despite citing Hirschfeld's same work in relation to the publicly accessible Royal Park in Karlsruhe. At this relatively early gardening work by him, Loudon appears to be occupied with the differences of equestrian and pedestrian promenades and other subsets of public green, and only fleetingly mentioning the principal requisites of extent and fresh air, the separation of different types of traffic, mentioning only refreshment of the amenities, with very little consideration to a more complex program of a public park. Perhaps it is not surprising that Lanny, who knew well what was happening in Prussia and beyond it in continental Europe, formed a scathing opinion of the programming of London's publicly accessible royal parks when visiting England in 1822, stating that these layouts appeared to be designed much more for the joy of the various cattle that graze around than for people. His designs for the Magdeburg Public Park in 1824 was well regarded by Loudon, who wrote in his Gardens magazine in 1834 that it is impossible not to admire the taste and applaud the skill of the accent artist who designed it. By this time, Loudon operated a vast network of horticulture intelligence. His knowledge on the German-speaking countries partly originated from Karl Ritter, born in Saxony, but advancing his landscape designing and garden writing career in Austria and Hungary, who gave his notes to Loudon in July 1835 to be published in the Gardens magazine the following year. Ritter transformed the Buckingham public park in what is today Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia, in 1832, originally created by the municipality as early as in 1775 as a public promenade. The designer of the Bauschligat, Heinrich Nebien, once more returned to public park design when he submitted a proposal for the layout of the Rosenthal Park in Leipzig in 1835. In his detailed master plan documentation, there is no mention of the novelty of the public park. By this time, the concept was well developed and established, and there were plenty of such municipal parks in the German-speaking lands. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph. Let's open it directly for questions.
Let's.
Who would like to start? I can always fulfill that function. I've always wondered at the terminology used in German for describing people's parks or people's gardens or city gardens. And the data you're provided, I think, is really indicative of significant changes. But what determined the actual use of different terminologies for specific public park sites?
You mean in relation to basically Volkspark or Stadtgarten or Stadtpark? I'm not entirely sure, to be fairly honest. I can only say that the word garden or Garten meant very different thing in Germany than in England, than in English. And there is a discussion of this in this book by Michael. It should be Michael Lee, and in this Leberecht Mieke publication, which explains that, for example, Englische Garten, it just simply means landscape park in German. So basically the garden is more like a pleasure ground, and it can be as large as you want, because the word landscape is not associated with private grounds. Landscape is a community or a society effort, and therefore the garden, that's why they use the garden. If you just try to kind of focus on why they use two terms and what is the difference between those two terms, I cannot give you an answer, I'm afraid. I did not detect any kind of differences between the terminology. I think Stadtpark later was kind of more clearer that it is happening in an urban environment.
Exactly, and the graph really reflected the trend
yeah.
in German urbanization in general. So
yes, the park is also like, yeah,
early 1860s. It's exactly what you would have predicted.
Yeah. Practically what happened is that, of course, it has always been urban, as it was set out at the very beginning, so there was no difference here. But basically, park is also a kind of newer word, which was not really accepted or used before. Like the Germans still use Rundfunk und Fernsehen for radio and television. They recognize the new terms, and they use it now kind of interchangeably. That's the same thing. So there's not, I don't really see much difference.
Yes. The other contributors. You didn't mention anything about Klosterberger Garten.
Yes.
Which I thought was strange omission, because that's Lenne.
Oh, no. That's the Magdeburg Garden.
What?
That's the Magdeburg. That's Lenne's design.
Yes, exactly. I know.
That's the Magdeburg Garden. I didn't use the name, but that's the same thing.
Okay. But that's a prime example of some of the limitations of the concept of a public park or garden, because in practice, of course, it simply reflected the socio-economic classifications of that time. Access by workers was extremely difficult in terms of the intensity, labor intensity of work, and the time that they had available to actually make use of it. And was it the Gesellschaftshaus? Was very much just for the upper middle class, people who could afford what it provided. So it was just a reflection of the inequality of access to a so-called people's park.
Yes, perhaps. But as Hirschfeld set it out, and also in the Wauschliget in Pest, it was clearly stated that everybody can.
But in reality, that's what I really...
So it's everybody could access it. And then those people who donated very little sums, they were very, very simple people. You could see that they were kind of craftsmen, or even less than that. So it's a real community effort in a way. So, and they also had access to the grants. There was no, funny what you say here is actually it happened later, much later, in the late 19th century, when then those people did not gain access to the park. There was an entry fee, there was a kind of dress code. Funnily, in that very early period, it did not apply, as far as I can tell. They even mentioned those people who are unemployed, for example, or strangers, meaning even perhaps vagabonds. I'm not entirely sure. I wouldn't go that far, but it clearly refers to very, very disadvantaged people, the sick mentions, and then which means the invalids and all those kind of people who would
So I have to
normally
remind
like
myself that we're leaving most of the discussion time
Yeah.
on Marie's orders towards the end of the 3 presentations. So maybe we should move on if there aren't any more specific questions. So this next presentation. And everything over to Daniel. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to Birkenhead, even online. And you have a really distinguished career, emeritus professor, PhD program coordinator, all these things at the University of Georgia. And you've had a long-lasting interest, research interest in landscape history. So,
Yep.
Well, I'll leave the floor to you.
Okay, I'll share my screen here. Can everyone see that?
No,
Yes.
not yet.
Is it up?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, it is.
All right. So first of all, thanks very much to Helen and Marie and Robert. I look forward very much to the possibility of coming to visit. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about some linkages to the UK, but in my abstract, I talked about those linkages as not a straight, bold line that, led from Birkenhead to American public parks that pop up like mushrooms across the United States, but probably more like a series of dotted lines. Here, as you look at Central Park and Bethesda Fountain to the right and the terrace, this image is from Picturesque America. And so, yes, this place, Birkenhead Park, was an inspiration to Olmsted, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. And there were many design moves that influenced his thinkings, particularly how when you move through the landscape, things would be hidden and then they would be revealed. And even though it's a relatively small space, there was a great deal of mystery and surprise that happened in the landscape. So at the left is what Frederick Law Olmsted, and as everyone said, just celebrated 200th anniversary of his birth yesterday, what he looked like when he visited Birkenhead Park, and to the right about what he would have looked like when he did Central Park in New York in about 8 years later. So in his Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, these are the quotes. His quote about that there was nothing comparable to this people's garden in the United States. Then he talked about what he saw, the winding paths and acres of constantly varying surface and so forth. And then the quotation that is often quoted about this being open to everyone. The poorest British peasant is free to enjoy it in all of its parts as the British queen. More than that, the baker of Birkenhead has a pride of owner, and is it not a grand good thing? And of course, I'm very aware of Robert Lee's and Karen Tucker's perspective on this, but I think the point I'm trying to make is not whether that is true, but whether Olmsted believed it to be true, and whether it was a need that needed to be filled in the United States. And so there's no doubt that some of the ideas that came from Birkenhead influenced moves that Olmsted and Vaux would later do in laying out New York's Central Park. But I want to present a little bit of a different and maybe more varied approach to how we might look into this portal and this connection to Birkenhead Park. And I want to do that by way of talking about the concept of civilization. So there were many commenters from Britain who, like Charles Dickens, framed Americans as rude and crude, tobacco-spitting ruffians who had very little culture. And that was, of course, much earlier than people like Anthony Trollope and William Howard, who are writing about the United States during the early years of the Civil War. But they're saying many of the same things. Some might say things haven't changed all that much in the United States, but I'll leave that up to all of you to think about that. In any case, Olmsted, though, was very upset by this kind of, let's say, picture that was painted of Americans, because he believed sincerely that not only the movement of civilization was inevitable, but that we were doing a pretty good job in this country, even though there was some backsliding that would happen. And so he laid out in a planned book, and the Olmsted papers from his time in California actually have all of his notes about how he was thinking about civilization. He intended to write a book, and he was interested in concepts such as civilization, progress, and improvement. Civilization was this, major force. Progress was sort of how you would measure steps toward accomplishing civilization, and improvement was almost like an ethic. It was this notion that within communities, within individuals, there should be ongoing improvement. Improvement gets used over and over and over again during this era, even to the point, of course, there's an organization related to managing what happens at Birkenhead that uses the term improvement. In the US, you have improvement associations, village improvement associations, landscape improvement, scenic improvement, and so forth and so on. So civilization had a couple of things to it. There were like rungs on a ladder, which meant that there were levels of civilization. And whenever you have a ladder kind of organization, you have people at the bottom and you have people at the top. But then there was the type of civilization which was about advancement of human character, really social improvement, so to speak. So the way improvement is talked about is it covers everything from land law to real estate, economic opportunity, and so forth. Scientific agriculture used the words to improve the soil and the mind. Psychological health and landscape improvement were connected. And so the American Social Science Association was an organization that both Frederick Billings to the left and Frederick Law Olmsted to the right were involved in. They became close friends when Billings went to California and headed up the Mariposa mining estate in the 1860s during the Civil War. So he writes a number of things at this time about how different disorders could be alleviated by engagement with the landscape. And I won't read through all these for the sake of time, but the second one is really important, that it therefore results in the enjoyment of the scenery employs on the mind without fatigue, and yet exercises it. It tranquilizes it, it enlivens it, and thus through the influence of the mind over the body gives the effect of refreshing rest and invigoration to the whole system. The other thing he said is this sort of ladder of civilization. Everyone can get it, but they get it in proportion to their cultivation, their taste. And so again, there's this idea that there are people that are like benevolent guides that should help the general population. So Frederick Billings, who is a land lawyer in California at the time, and then becomes president of the Northern Pacific Railroad, becomes fast friends with Olmsted. And when he goes to the West and works on the railroad, he talks about the importance of parks, and that is, the idea of, he uses the term squares, but he also puts parks in the communities that were developed as a way of, calming the population down and eliminating various disorders that are there. So in California, both of these two engage a very rough and ready culture. There was a vigilance committee, seeing in the middle right, where they actually hung people. They took law and order in their own hands. The miners were rough and ready. There were gangs up in the upper right called the Hounds that would attack different settlements and so forth. So after you get to the point where Olmsted moves back to the east and Billings buys stock in the Northern Pacific Railroad around 1870, he actually hires Olmsted to do a design for Tacoma, Washington, which was to be the grand terminus of the Northern Pacific Railroad. That never gets built, but you can see, as with most of the communities that were laid out, there were parks. And so here's a scene of the Golden Spike, the opening of the Northern Pacific in the 1880s. But in the early 1870s, things were in their early stages as this railroad was intended to cut across the entire United States. The idea was, in order to pay for it, the government gave the railroads 20 miles on either side of the tracks in states and 40 miles on either side of the tracks in territories. And then every other section in this sort of checkerboard pattern would be sold, and those profits would go to the railroad to fund the construction. And so it was in the railroad's best interest to get these rails laid as quickly as possible so that they could establish communities. Billings, Montana is named for Frederick Billings. On the right are different patterns that were used for the railroad towns, going from the symmetric to the orthogonal to the T-town, and they kind of go in order of kind of an orderly progression from the earliest on the left to the latest on the right. So as they built the Northern Pacific across northern Minnesota, they land first down here where there's a dip in the rails in Crow Wing County, established the town of Brainerd, which was a central spot for the Northern Pacific. They had a number of installations there to help build tracks and to organize the company. And here you have Gregory Square, Chippewa Park, and so forth. So right away, even though these are very rough and ready kinds of places, there's this idea that parks were absolutely essential to the people that would live there. As they push into Dakota territory and into the town of Fargo, there's the establishment of Island Park along the Red River, really in a place that would tend to flood whenever the Red River flooded. So it was also a little bit of a kind of blue-green storage type of facility. On the left is an early postcard, the way that you could actually get yourself onto Island Park from the river itself. And then you begin to move into the center of the town, and many times they would have a square, and this is a square that the Northern Pacific developed themselves right off the rails. You can see that facing the downtown of Fargo. And then as you go west into Dickinson, North Dakota, by this time Billings is president in the late 1870s, they picked features like Rocky Butte to build a park around. This wasn't something that could be developed. So, set it aside, and that becomes the recreational opportunity in the community. And then as you move into Montana territory, there's this town called Miles City, located here. And again, the idea that in an area where it would tend to flood, save that area, set it aside, and create Riverside Park in that particular landscape. So the belief was, in this very rough and ready time, as you look at one of the first structures built in Miles City, a saloon, of course. There needed to be something, and of course, 1877 was also an era of great violence, something to counteract the sort of violent tendencies, calm people down, and add to their improvement as human beings. And it was also related to an influx of immigrants into the United States, driven by the railroads themselves. The railroads had offices in many European countries, Bohemians on the left, Ukrainians on the right, and Norwegians in the center. And so Stark County, where Dickinson is located in North Dakota, had all of these populations listed here. And that was another thing that Billings and his cohort of people that were helping manage the railroad thought that, you know, somehow we needed to meld all these people together as a new culture, an American culture, and that parks would be part of that, that entire story. So in the end, as you look at an older Frederick Olmsted on the left and an older Frederick Billings on the right, yes, there was this sense that all layers of society could benefit, except for those who were at the bottom rung, those that they called savages, as you look at Sitting Bull in the center. They were left out of this particular picture. So that's my freight train ride along the Northern Pacific Railroad related to these ideas.
Well, thank you ever so much, Daniel. I suffered a break in the power connection, so I didn't catch your first phases, but I really enjoyed the presentation. And again, if anyone wants to raise any factual questions, we can take those now before moving on to our final.
Oh, excuse me.
So let's turn to Jan and his long-standing friend, Robert Marnock. You've written quite a bit about Marnock in previous years, and I've always found the contributions extremely interesting and insightful. So I'm delighted that we persuaded you to contribute today as part of our program. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, here we go. I'll try and share whether that works. Share. Yes, we're doing well here. Yeah, is this visible for you all?
Yeah.
Or do you see it still with the slides underneath? Well, never mind. Yeah, so I'm going to talk today about the construction of a green infrastructure for London, initiated by Robert Marnock and his students, and the main students being Alexander Mackenzie and William Robinson. Robert Marnock had started in Sheffield as a curator for the Botanical Gardens, and had come to significance here with his design for the gardens, and later on soon got integrated within Sheffield culture. That Sheffield culture was determined by James Silk Buckingham, the person who initiated the Select Committee for Public Walks, and the report, which was written by Chadwick. And there's one person who's still got his mic on, or her mic on. Okay. Yeah, so and one of the things they looked at were the foreign presidents. First of all, provisions for burial, and that was seen as a provision as a public park as well at that time, with the examples of both Paris and Liverpool, which was ahead at the time in the creation of cemeteries as well as botanic gardens, which were seen as the public gardens of the time. In Sheffield, Robert Marnock became immediately involved at the Sheffield General Cemetery, where he designed the area within a picturesque mode, which you see here. This painting was produced in 1834, which shows the sort of proposals, the proposed situation. And here an internal view of it, showing sort of the picturesque planting and the way the natural slope is enhanced with its classical buildings. And a few years later, with the extension as well, also produced by Robert Marnock. The other aspect was the immediate fact that they were trying to achieve a connection between the different places. Most clearly visible, and this is the Botanic Garden here, which Marnock had created, and across the valley is the Botanic Garden, and these were connected with each other with sort of avenues of lime trees, which became Marnock's signature tree. So, and that may have been inspired by Loudon's sort of ideas for breathing places for the metropolis. The suggestion of the creation of a park system in a circular manner around the city of London in order to provide a sanitary, healthier environment. Much of it had started within London with the debate about public parks. It started with Regent's Park, as we heard at the beginning of the session, when David Yates said a few words. And a number of proposals were made, and there's a whole sort of progression of how the idea, the notion of the public park was developed from Regent's Park particularly, and St. James's Park. But within that, in the center of Regent's Park, was the inner circle, which was the highest point, which was developed by Robert Marnock as a botanic garden, which you see here. And developed as a botanic garden, but in a picturesque style. So that, that connected the various bits of the park and became an integrated part of the park layout as a whole, as well as a popular destination and a public resort where society would meet, and particularly the frequent flower shows that were being held there. And here's a couple of pictures of these events. Well, so Robert Marnock was the curator by that stage of the botanical gardens, the Royal Botanical Gardens, as they were then known as. And at the same time, he acted as a consultant and advisor, a landscape advisor for various projects. The one thing that was playing greatly was the proposals for Greater Paris, which was influential. The proposals by Haussmann particularly, which consisted of a series of creating a series of boulevards to connect the various parts of the city, and at the same time introducing a sewage system and an underground system, and with it a series of public parks which were included within the network so that they will be accessible to everyone, and two forests, two woodlands, one to the east and one to the west, Bois de Vincennes and Bois de Boulogne. That model became sort of an inspirational model, particularly with the notion of the boulevard, which became something that was aspired to by all Western cities, including those in the United States. And when London got in trouble in the early 19th century, the the issue was around the river, which, with the introduction of the water closet in the late 18th century, had become a sewage system. The Thames carried the sewage in and out with the tides, and it became a smelly business. So smelly that questions were raised in Parliament, and the Thames was seen as monster soup, and the various beasties would be made visible, and it became the talk of the town. Something needed to be done, and Bazalgette was commissioned to resolve the problem. Well, he came up with the proposal to introduce a new sewage system that led to 2 pumping stations that would get the stuff out at the far end of the Thames rather than at the beginning, and also that there would be sort of cleansing. And together with that sewage system, there was a possibility to introduce a series of boulevards, and this was being striven for. So when the Thames Embankment was laid out as part of that process, instead of building up the area that was gained because the Thames was narrowed in order to increase the flow of the water, so in order to prevent this happening, a series of parks was being proposed, as well as the whole network of underground pipes, underground railway, and sewage system. And on top, there was a boulevard, the first boulevard in this country, the Thames Embankment, which is planted with French plane trees. Was the great sort of symbol of modern London. As well as these gardens, all created by Alexander Mackenzie, who was one of Marnock's students, who went out and took the commissions for the Department of Works created. Marnock himself was involved in a number of the gardens. I've given one example here, the Temple Gardens, which as a result of additional land were extended. Yeah, the law lords weren't being challenged for the ground that was being gained, and it wasn't taken completely for public parks, but it was given to them. Designed by Marnock, who produced a bank to screen the traffic along the embankment, and with trees on the top in order to provide a veil for what was behind on the south bank, which was of course industry. So that was to be screened and out of view. Well, in addition, a large number of parks were being created. I've just got the example here of Finsbury Park. There were additional ones, and all designed by Alexander Mackenzie. Marnock himself became involved with Burnham Beaches, where he provided a plan to make those accessible, and that became the equivalent to Bois de Boulogne, whereas Bois de Vincennes, the equivalent was Epping Forest, which where Alexander Mackenzie ultimately became the superintendent. Marnock himself continued with various other projects, all trying to sort of create links, interconnections. And that included the proposal for the communal gardens at Ladbroke Grove. Here, a housing development was created on top of a former horse rink, and that included a series of back gardens that were all interconnected and were the first communal gardens provided. I've got a couple of slides here to show you what that looks like, coming out at the back of the houses and with access from the rear gardens into the communal space. So that was one example of a communal garden shown here on a further illustration. Well, so there was a propensity to create parks, gardens, and the other effort where he put his work in was in getting burial out of the city, advising on supposedly one of the greatest public, no, not public, provisions for burial outside London, near Woking, where the greatest 2,000-acre cemetery was being created in order to get burial out of the city, and that was supposed to replace all the burial. And that was, of course, not enough. And the other effort he put his work towards is in promoting cremation, again with the intention of getting burial out of the city. And he was involved with the first crematorium created in Woking, also in 1884. And there was ultimately a garden here outside the crematorium, a memorial garden, which became a model that was later taken. By the way, Robert Marnock was one of the first 100 people to be cremated in this country, in the Woking crematorium. His ashes being interred in the grave, in this grave. You see the stone next to John Claudius Loudon's grave, whom was his great sort of mentor. His student, in the meanwhile, William Robinson, wrote about creating gardens, memorial gardens, in God's Acre Beautiful. Basically, this was a promoting of cremation within cities, that he ultimately was involved with in the design of Golders Green, very much according to the principles being promoted by Robert Marnock, with a garden, an open, picturesque garden with sort of provision where people might spread ashes. So Marnock's work was spread over a number of efforts, but all to provide greater provision for the people within the city. And and what I've done here is select a limited number of cases so that it gives you a taste of his oeuvre. Thank you very much.
Robert, I don't know how to raise my hand, but I have a question if it's appropriate.
Good, that's what I was hoping.
John, I wondered if Marnock had any ties with Norfolk Park. Norfolk Park has always been a bit of a mystery to me. It was formed in, 1841 or something in Sheffield. Yeah. And they show Archibald Wilson as the designer of that. And so really two questions. Was there a connection there in any kind? Was the first one. And the second is, my British history isn't the best, but my understanding is that Chartism was very strong in Sheffield at around that period, and that one of the motivations for Ellison, who was Norfolk's agent, was in fact to mitigate Chartism. It really ties in with Daniel's early paper about civilization. Would you have any reaction or comment to that?
Yeah. Well, this is the subject of a chapter which I've written about the whole thing. For a book on Robert Marnock, which I'm hopefully able to finish in the coming few months. The connection between Marnock and the Duke of Norfolk was very close. The Duke of Norfolk was the patron of the Sheffield Botanic Garden, but he was also the chair of the Royal Botanic Society, which laid out the Royal Botanic Garden in Regent's Park.
Mhm.
So Marnock knew him intimately. He knew Ellison, he knew Archibald Wilson. And so it is and he also designed the gardens for the Duke of Norfolk, for his private house, the farm in Sheffield. So there is, and I would be really surprised if he wasn't the designer of Norfolk Park.
What about the influence of Chartism? Was that a factor in these sorts of things in Sheffield? Because
absolutely. The whole thing, the start of the Botanic Gardens and the General Cemetery was all part of this sort of general effort, and gave a foothold and provided a very important voice for a large group of people who had been very disenfranchised. And you know, the Duke of Norfolk was also special. You know, he was a Catholic, so he was outside the normal realm, and he was, you know, supportive in many ways. And this is so it is all part of this. And I mentioned James Silk Buckingham, who of course was similarly, you know, he was special. He was a promoter. He had set up a newspaper in India which rallied against the Brits and gave a voice to a whole group of people there who had never had a voice. And as a result, the paper was closed. He went into a court case, which he won ultimately. And on the basis of that, when he was back in England, he was invited to become an MP for Sheffield, to sort of give the workers in Sheffield a voice as well. So it is very much, you know, sort of, you would almost, if socialism had been invented by that stage, you would call it socialism, but of course it hadn't. So it's a very interesting sort of development in this area here. Yeah. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you.
Who else would like to raise a question? What do we know about the structure and nature of the advisory role that Marnock had? What was his remuneration? Was it paid for by the Metropolitan Board of Works? And how can we distinguish between the input into this vision as to how to transform London into a green paradise, to move in that direction, between Marnock's influence and perhaps the more critical role of people you refer to as his students, who I imagine actually wanted to develop their own independence as key contributors and employed contributors to the wider scheme.
Yeah. Well, what I've done is pick up. There is it's one general statement. Alexander Mackenzie wrote Thoroughfares. What is it called? The book, a book on thoroughfares of London. And that really provides the idea for the links provided between the various parks. He promoted it. He was, of course, initially I think it was called the curator of Alexandra Palace Park. And so he promoted it very strongly. And that is probably the strongest statement through Alexander Mackenzie. But there are various articles, and particularly in The Garden, published by William Robinson, which give an idea as to the ideas that were being promoted. And then it is by looking at the various projects and reading what they were trying to accomplish, and then trying to find the links between the people who had whom he was working for and what they were trying to promote. And that is why that raised by John Crompton is so important. And those are exactly the things, the social issues that were being raised. And Marnock was part of the independent movement outside the Church of England. And his father-in-law promoted education of children in this area, very much based on what was happening also already happening in Scotland, and from which Robert Marnock benefited, a much higher standard of education in Scotland than in England, where literacy was much greater, which was also the reason for the rise of all these Scottish boys as in important positions within this, including Loudon with his proposals for London, and Marnock, of course, and Alexander Mackenzie, and Joseph Maston, who was another one of that group of designers, landscape designers. So yeah, there is a whole story to be told here from a different perspective.
Wait to see it all in print.
Yeah,
it would be great. But this Marnock, I mean, in a sense, he shared some of the wider social objectives that Billings advocated and tried to implement, both in terms of social welfare and in particular in generating green space, even if it was liable to frequent flooding for people flooding into the cities created by the development of the railway network. Where did Billings get his concepts in terms of green space design from? Were they essentially from Olmsted alone?
Well, I'm in the process of completing a book, which is going to be titled American, well, I'm still thinking about the title, but I think it's going to be about civilization in the broad sense, but improvement. So I'm thinking about calling it American Landscape Improvement, Influences and Influencers, the Frederick Billings story, and then his life dates at the end. So there are a lot of people that influence his thinking. Among them is Thomas Starr King, who wrote about the landscape of New Hampshire, but also then goes to California and writes about the Sierra Nevadas, the area that becomes Yosemite National Park and so forth. And then Olmsted for sure. They had, when Olmsted arrived in California to take over Mariposa, Billings met him at the wharf and took him to Mariposa. Once Olmsted became chair of the Yosemite Commission, Billings was there visiting during about the time he wrote, or let's say distributed and spoke about the Yosemite and Mariposa Big Trees report, which a number of his social theories about civilization came out in that report as well. So yeah, there was that. But, a certain class of people at that time always looked at the landscape through the lenses of sublime, beautiful, and picturesque. They had aesthetic education he did at the University of Vermont that was very fitting. And so there was a sort of a lifetime progression of landscape observation, landscape thinking, and then influences from people like Olmsted that made a difference. And a lot of it too is just, and the real point is Central Park is 1858. And before 2 decades even pass, they're sure that they have to put them in a rough and ruddy town along the rails in, really tough country. They just have to have a park there. That's to use a term that used to be on Star Trek, if any of you are Trekkies, that's warp speed for the 19th century. So
presumably the major railway companies owned quite a lot of the land in the townships that
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
developed.
Yeah.
So they controlled the supply of land.
They controlled the supply of land, and you know, they often sold it in large quantities. You know, at first Billings wanted to sell it sort of piece by piece to, you know, have almost Jefferson's vision of, you know, self-sufficient yeoman farmers, that kind of thing. But they ended up after the Great Panic of 1873 selling huge chunks, and then they were resold, and they were often resold to various immigrant communities. They would come in families, and then they would write, you know, my heritage is Czech, and they didn't settle along the rails of the Northern Pacific, but they settled in similar circumstances, and then they would, you know, write home to their family, and more would come and settle that landscape.
But isn't the concept, this hierarchical, almost racist concept?
Well, yeah, I mean, here's
inimitable to
that's yeah.
concept of the role of parks as a force for democratization.
Yeah, it's both. You know, this is the thing about history, is more than one thing can be true at the same time. And he sincerely believed that the way forward was to help elevate people in terms of you know, all of the social things that we think are important. On the other hand, there were people that would get it more slowly than others, and there were people that were left out of the equation, namely Native Americans. So yeah, both things are true.
Elizabeth, can you think of any British railway entrepreneurs who had a similar approach to the importance of creating a green space for people to enjoy? I mean, Brassey was involved with the development of Birkenhead Park. But people like Joseph Locke, were extremely rich, and simply use that money to purchase landed estates. There's no sign of any sort of wider social commitment, as we find in the case of William.
Mm-hmm.
Robert?
Sorry, yes.
I think David Jakes had a question after Christoph's presentation.
Oh, I can see the hand. Yes, of course.
Maybe we could take this last question and then we should conclude, because we had time. Thanks.
David.
Yes, I was going to say that the question that bedeviled all the early public parks was the question of funding.
Yes.
How do you get the money together? And Central Park was all right because it had a local government that could could tax its people.
That's right.
The same actually was true with Birkenhead. They were a corporation which overruled any sort of local parish politics, and they could raise rates. You know, nowadays, of course, all local authorities raise rates, but they didn't then. And I understand that Varusliget, if I got the name right, had to depend on subscriptions,
yes,
and not on taxation. And so it did have difficulties in getting completed.
Yes.
Is that right? And
partly right. There was taxation. The city taxed people, and it channeled some of that money into the Varusliget Park, as well as dedicated auctions, land auctions, which directly went without taking anything away. So there was basically the pot had multiple sources: city money, basically municipal money from taxation, land auctions, and public sponsorship,
donations.
Donations.
Yeah.
So there was different sources, and actually, as the money was drying up from both land auctions and donations, the main source became basically city municipality money.
David, Sandra, it's lovely to see you here. Would anyone else who's not have anything to say like to ask a question? No? That's not a problem. And it's time really to wind up, as Marie, who is keeping this all in order, has already indicated. Thank you ever so much for contributing. I've really enjoyed it very much. And our next meeting online is in a month's time. What is the date? Can you remind me, Marie?
Yeah, sure. So it's the 25th of May at the same time, 6 British Summer time.
Yes, we'll have 3 presentations again.
4 actually.
4 actually.
So the session might be a bit longer.
Okay, so we have 4 presentations, which I look forward again with great pleasure. 2 other points. We're hoping still to have a face-to-face meeting here in Birkenhead. We can show you fascinating parks in Liverpool, the country's first national country park here on the Wirral. But most importantly, it will give us a chance to work our way through the agenda that's already beginning to emerge from our discussions today. We would like you very much to submit, under no time pressure really, a proper version, full-length paper, because again, we're hoping, as we did with the Kemp Symposium, to publish a really impressive book or journal, special issue that focuses on the themes that we've laid down as being important for this symposium. And we've thought of 2 sets of possible dates in October, and Marie maybe can remind us what those are.
Sorry, I have to find your email again.
It's really the first 2 proper weeks in October, and we'll send you details of those dates, and we'll try and make some provisional bookings in the old Birkenhead Town Hall and here at the Visitor Centre, so that we can offer you a really good time, apart from the academic exchange.
So it was either the 6th, between the 6th and the 8th of October, or 13, 15.
That's it, yes, yes. But we'll put that all in emails so that you can consider which of those 2 options would be best for you. Apart from a few technological problems, I think the session has gone well, very well, and it's been very enjoyable. And you can see some clear major issues emerging from the 3 papers, which are looking at these questions in a different geographical spatial context. And I think that's the way forward very much, that we can learn from the collective experience of humankind, whether it's in Germany or Hungary, in America, or in this country. So they've dovetailed, I think, in that sense, extremely well. So I'm sorry if we've strayed over the original time limit, but we might as well make the most of these opportunities because they are enjoyable, and that's what we're really interested in. Developing human knowledge, concentrating on key issues in our areas of interest and expertise, and enjoying the discussions and the sharing of knowledge. Thank you all very much for participating. So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much.